Thank you, Beatriz, for that amazing presentation. I will just read my presentation because I want to be clear about some simple topics. I think those topics are very simple, but they have some power to be applied to a theory of content. So I will present an overview of what I call mediational fields and dynamic situated senses. My purpose is to show how these notions can be useful to characterize the structure of experiences and thoughts and their relations. As a way to introducing the topics, I will draw some lessons from the famous debate between Dreyfus and McDowell. I will present an outline of Cousin's distinction between mediational and referential contents, and I will draw some consequences from there. So firstly, I would like to know that even accepting McDowell's characterization of human experience as essentially permeated with conceptuality, that by itself is not a view, as McDowell recognizes, against the possibility of postulating other kinds of knowledge. Experiences of non-rational animals, although non-essentially permeated by conceptuality, are still animal-involved experiences that discloses for them an environment of motivational forces. A non-rational animal experience may not disclose a world of truth conditional structures, but it could perfectly provide openness to a world structure as a motivational space. A domain presented as an environment of affordances, solicitations, and sensory motor patterns of guidance, a field of pulling and pushing attractive and repulsive forces, as Dreyfus would say, a field of cognitive spatiotemporally situated structures of traits and rhythms of activity, as Cousins would say, or a field of sensory motor understandings, as Albanoe would say. McDowell points out that it is a quick and not really good argument to move from the possibility of describing the structure of the experience of non-rational animals as permeated by a kind of knowledge that presents for them a world as a world of mediational fields, to the ascription of non-conceptual contents as the ground of human experiences. I will assume here that McDowell's view is by and large correct. That is, in order to make sense of the epistemological claim according to which our experiences of the world justify our judgments, we should admit that conceptual capacities exercised at the level of thought's constitution are already operative and actualized at the level of experiences constitution. They can be actualized in experience in a different way from the way in which they are actualized in thought. For instance, as thematic and propositional at the level of thoughts, and non-thematic or non-propositional but categorical at the level of experience. Anyway, conceptual capacities exercised in thought formation can, why not, in the case of rational animals, be actualized in experience. But that by itself doesn't constitute an argument against the possibility of other ways of cognition in which the world is disclosed as a space that is not or need not be truth conditionally structured. How are those ways of experience in which the world is not presented as a truth conditional structure? How the world is presented when it is structured as a mediational and motivational space? Is it sui generis and non-conceptual, or is that just a redundant way in which conceptual contents are presented? Those are genuine questions, I think, that are not completely solved by assuming McDowell's epistemological stance against the given and against the attached conceptuality. So in order to tackle those questions, I will draw some lessons from Cousin's distinction between mediational and referential contents. Second, Cousins provides a positive characterization of two varieties of modes of presentation relative to the two different kinds of normative guidance or epistemic commitments, two kinds of being answerable to the world. Truth-guided contents present the world as a realm of reference, objects, properties, relations, possible words, etc. Environmental and active guiding contents present the world as a realm of mediations. affects, affordances, solicitations that are subject to glide path normative feedback. That is, the kind of silent guidance that a plane could be subject to if it deviates from its route, and have subjectivity or genus-phase balance. That is, mediational contents face both mind and word at the same time. Mediational contents, to sum up, present the word as an access structure, an intertwined structure of normative feedback, affordances, solicitations, affects, and subjectivity balance. This corresponds to what I call mediational fields, a disclosure of an environment as a domain of guiding forces that relate agents with objects of its cognition as mediations and motivations for its activities. All of this without presupposing a separation between objects, agents, activities, mediations, and motivations. And that is precisely the point of calling them fields. Examples of mediational contents are mental states that highly depend on its conditions of production and are motivationally active from those conditions. Profiles of pain and joy, scratching and hotness feelings, expressions of yomi and joki are basic examples of NASA's structure. Those states drive the agent to behave in some specific ways and provide for him a punctual way to be committed to its surroundings. Those ways to behave do not constitute merely reactive responses, but normative patterns of commitments and avoidances linked to the environmental possibilities and to the agent's bodily constitution. Affects, affordances, solicitations, environmentally placed and embodied, serve as mediations for developing cognitive activities and guide the improvement of those activities. It is useful to contrast the disclosure of an environment as a mediational field, as an access structure, to a disclosure of the world as a referential domain, as an extensional structure of objects and n-tuples. Mediational contents present the world as dynamic and situated patterns of thrill and rhythms. Referential contents present the world as stable structures of thought makers. Mediational contents change according to how the flow of activity in the environment changes. They are open for all to be followed, but it is possible to follow them only from the particular situation and disposition in which the agent is related to them. Only for a particular agent in a particular situation, an affordance like go out through this open space solicits him to have an agent involving experience of going out through that open space. Any other agent is able to have that experience, but only the one who is placed in that specific condition is drawn to do that. Cousins uses the distinction to draw a theoretic line between thoughts and experiences. The characteristic contents of judgments are susceptible to evaluations in terms of truth conditions and present the world as a realm of reference. The characteristic contents of experience are susceptible to evaluations in terms of skillful performance and activity guidance and present the world as a realm of mediations. But there is no need to map the distinction between mediational and referential contents, neither onto the distinction between conceptual and non-conceptual contents, nor onto the distinction between experience and thought to see the relevance of Cousin's points. That is the main reason why I will talk more about mediational fields than about non-conceptual contents. The other reasons being the mathematical connotation of fields as vector fields, and the ethnogeographic connotation of fields as extensions of territory or extensions of carved landscapes. Since I do think that a formal appropriate tool to represent the specifications of contents relative to embodied skills and to study their properties consists in using vector field representations of feature placing spaces. And that is also an idea that appears in Austin Clarke in Sensory Qualities. And I also do think that to provide a more substantive approach, it is required to develop ethnogeographic descriptions of transformations from trails to territories carved by trails activity. And that's a description that also appears in Hutchins' Cognition in the Wild. But I won't pursue those further developments today. McDowell's arguments against the postulation of non-conceptual level of contents for explaining humans' cognitive ability to have word-involving experiences leave untouched Cousins and Dreyfus' characterization of a way to disclose or present the word as a mediational field. More crucially, it leaves untouched a view in which judicative contents are fundamentally ground over our abilities to disclose the word as a mediational field. My main point here is that the distinctions, mediational, referential, conceptual, non-conceptual, experience, thought, know-how, know-that, can be conceived as orthogonal. In the famous debate, Dreyfus is at pains to argue that mediational fields, or as he calls them following Merleau-Ponty, the space of motivations or the space of motor intentionality, constitute a sui generis space not reducible to the logical space of reasons nor to the logical space of causes. McDowell's line of defense consists mainly in noticing that his notion of conceptuality is not a notion of detachable contents. That is, a notion that is not reduced to the specification of senses in terms of an abstract and non-conceptual determination of truth conditions. He shares with Evans a dynamic and situated conception of senses that permeates, together with his Aristotelian conception of practical rationality, his view about conceptual contents, so that it is perfectly coherent for him to state the following. I do not dispute that perceptual responsiveness to affordances, necessarily bound up with embodied coping skills, is something we share with animals. And I can accept that there is a sense in which familiarity with affordances is a background for our openness to objects. But I can still hold that our openness to affordances is part of the way of being that is special to rational animals. What perception discloses to human beings is not restricted to affordances. What is right about describing openness to affordances as providing a background is this. The fact that perception discloses a word to us is intelligible only in a context that includes embodied coping competence, the responsiveness to affordances that we share with other animals. It seems also coherent to continue McDowell's line of thought without disputing his point about practical and singular conceptuality, adding the following. What perception discloses to human beings is not restricted to abstract truth conditional structures. As I said before, that distinction can be, as McDowell argues, transversal to the distinction between conceptual and non-conceptual content. We can even deny that there are two kinds of content. It does not seem, however, a good strategy to deny that there are two aspects manifestly present in the constitutions of thoughts and experiences. The disclosure of a domain in terms of the structure required to determine the truth of a thought or of an experience, and the disclosure of the domain in terms of a field of cognitive guidance and practical impact. It is not necessary to argue that the spaces of reason, causes, and motivations are disjunctive in order to see that Dreyfus and Cousins' characterization of non-conceptual content is not reducible to abstract specifications of truth conditions. There may not be a way to draw the precise limits between those two ways of structure the domain, but in their pure form, those are orthogonal ways to structure the domain. 3, and the final section, the distinction between the type of ontology that is present as a mediational field or as a referential domain, or by the type of normativity that governs its structure, the normativity of truth and the normativity of guidance in activity, it's useful to see that not all notions of conceptuality are situated enough to support the intrinsic motivational aspect of experience. Not all specifications in terms of satisfaction conditions are situated enough to structure cognition as guidance in activity or as active guidance. Every animal accesses his environment through his own sui generis agent-involving way of cognition. Those different cognition could be characterized as varieties of ways of structuring its surroundings, from more punctuated structures anchored to one particular point of view, to more general ways, structures enforced through different points of view. A continuum that has at its limiting points ways of disclosing a word as pure field of mediation and as pure domain of reference. Cognition.
Sorry,
¿Sí?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Yeah, I will end. Cognitions are attempts that have as their products items, contents, or representations whose structure is more or less close to one of those ways of disclosing the environment. There may not be actually a form of cognition as purely referential or as purely mediational, but the point is that environmental situated specifications of mediational fields and abstract specification of thought conditions can serve as orthogonal dimensions to specify different varieties of stable kinds of cognition and representation. The characterization of a being, biological, artificial, or socio-technical as a cognitive being, and the way in which it cognitively structures its environment ought to be the final, not the starting point of the inquiry. I am assuming here that the limits of conceptuality, pure or impure, can be drawn by the generality constraint. At the same time, I am denying that the limits of mindedness, representationality, and contentfulness are stated by the generality constraint. A concept must be something capable of being recombined with other concepts in the conceptual stock of a subject. Purely referential contents satisfy the generality constraint. Purely mediational contents do not satisfy it. But to be able to satisfy the constraint is not equivalent to being detachable. That the content is thinkable does imply that it satisfies the generality constraint, but does not imply that the content is structured by an abstract condition. Contents are thinkable or conceptual if they can be transformed, as McDowell argues, into something that satisfies the generality constraint. Satisfying this property demands for the content to have the potential to be determined relative to an abstract, but also relative to a situated specification of its truth conditions. So I developed this point about abstract specifications and demonstrative concept in this paragraph, but I will pull out this paragraph and go to the final paragraphs. It seems that human experience and understanding is neither purely punctuated nor purely general. One feature of our cognition seems to be that its contents are holistic. A frisbee coming from here in this way with this circular shape could be perceived as the same frisbee coming from there in that way with that elliptical shape. We could react with a movement here and now, and with different movements there and a few seconds later to capture the same stable perception or the same stable meaning. The structure of the content is dependent to some extent on our abilities to transform this punctuated feature here and now to something more objective. Is this feature here and now something that can exclusively be experienced from that particular point of view and not be experienced from other points? The answer depends on the abilities we possess. If we, phylogenetically and ontogenetically, are able or not to develop a general structure from perspectival ones. Final paragraph, McDowell's argumentation is directed to show that the postulation of conceptual contents does not exclude guidance in the flow of activity. It should be so because we are able to justify our judgments based on our perceptions and rationally respond for the consequences of our actions. Demonstrative concepts not only are not detachable from its occasion of use, they also play a role in mediating and motivating activities. Characterized as dynamic situated senses, they are in fact more suitable to capture the structure of the world as a mediational field than abstract concepts. That argumentation entails that the structure of our cognition presents the world as a mediational field, but I am adding something more. Conceptual contents are not entirely situated and dynamic if they were not able to be at least partly specified relative to embodied and environmental possibilities to mediate and motivate activities. McDowell's truth conditional specification of concepts as dynamic situated senses does not determine its structure in terms of the mediational dimension, but there is no need to oppose McDowell's view to a view that takes our possibilities to disclose a motivational and mediational world as fundamental to all kinds of animated cognition, just to complement it with the Evansian part of the story. Thank you. That was all.
Thanks, Carlos. Any questions?
I have first, thank you for your talk, Carlos. I was trying to understand a little better what you mean by orthogonal. I didn't quite grasp what your is more in a general point that, to me, if you concede to McDowell the conceptual character of experience, perception, you already, I don't know, that to me seems very incompatible with Alva Noah's notion of sensimotor understanding and all the talk. I didn't quite understand, maybe because it was a little shocking to me, but how you conciliate those things.
One point is that the Dreyfus conception of embodied copying skills is compatible with McDowell's notion of conceptuality, and that is one thing that McDowell recognizes in the debate. Like he doesn't deny that human experience has that dimension of embodied copying. But that's the debate between McDowell and Dreyfus. My idea, or the idea of Cousins, is to take those two dimensions and a specification of contents in terms of truth conditions and a specification of contents in terms of how they allow to reproduce activities or how they guide activity in environment, and how they anchor it to embody the skills, to specify the content in another way, which is the mediational way. What I mean by orthogonal is that they are just two dimensions, like in a Cartesian plane, that are not reducible one to the other. Or say, in their pure form, the pure specification of contents relative to the embodied skills is not reduced to the specification of content in terms of truth conditions. They form like an orthogonal space, and in that orthogonal space, then we could identify some stable notions of cognition or of representation. So the idea is that cognitions and representations are subregions in that space in which their axes are mediational specifications of contents and referential specifications of contents. That, like, we have two ways to specify the content. Those are not two kinds of contents, but those are not two contents, but two ways to specify the same content.
We have a question from Sophia.
Hi, Carlos.
Hi, Sophia. Hi,
Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
So my question is related to your answer to Jefferson. When you say that you could explain a representational dimension as kind of in another dimension as the mediation. How you say, mediational or
mediational? Sí.
Mediational yes. Dimension. So you would have two dimensions, but where would they really cross? So my thing is, in which sense they relate to each other? Mm-hmm. Because you have this, okay, you have this kind of allegory of dimensions, but dimensions are they they are all also separated from each other, in the sense that
Yes.
they cross in a given point, but
Yes.
yes,
Yeah.
you understand. So
Yeah, I
it's a
understand. Yeah.
minimal, it's a
Yeah.
minimal relation. Yes.
What I mean by dimension is two dimensions are orthogonal, and that's the point. Those dimensions are orthogonal, so they only cross in one point. It's like a Cartesian plane. Yeah. And in the Cartesian plane, you can draw a lot of vectors inside the Cartesian plane. But the mediational dimension and the referential dimension serve as coordinates to specify kinds of cognitions, different kind of cognitions, and they cross for example, in the animal world of cognition. Like some animals have are closer to the mediational kind of cognition. For example, rodents or mammals or apes. And some others are more close to the referential dimension, like human beings or gods, if there were, or aliens or intelligent aliens. The point is that it doesn't matter what are we talking about, if we are talking about animals or artificial artifacts, or about aliens, or about gods, or about we could specify varieties of stable kinds of cognitions relative to those two orthogonal dimensions, without presupposing that they don't cross, that without assuming that they are different sui generis levels, like because in the debate between Dreyfus and McDowell, most of the time the idea is presented as if we had a causal level and a sensory motor level, and then a conceptual level. As if there were three levels, but I don't think that
Carlos, the thing is, embodied cognition theories, I don't want to take much time, but the cognition, the embodied cognition theories, they would say, as for example, started by Gibson, they would say that you just have representation because you have a kind of situational body, that situationed body. So in the sense that you don't, I think it's very difficult to make really a distinction between where a representation starts and where movement ends. So I don't know if it's like you have two dimensions, but these two dimensions are just conceptual dimensions, not real dimensions. That I think that's my point. Yes.
Yeah, those are theoretic tools to represent kinds of cognition. But obviously, those kinds of cognitions are mixed, have mixed elements in their constitution. But the idea is to contrast the enactivist view that representations belong to one domain, and motor intentionality belongs to other domain. Like it is in the literature from Gibson and that comes from the enactivist view. Most of the time, the ideas present like there are two kinds of domains: the domain of sensory motor activity or of evolutionary defined contents, and the domain of referential or representational contents. And I think that's wrong from the beginning. Like, we could define different kinds of representations with mixed elements with a specification of the elements into dimensions.
Okay, it's clear now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We don't have more time for questions. Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you.